Two empires faced one another across the Baltic. Sweden, an extraordinary military machine at the height of its 17th century power, and a Russia that was vast, resourceful, but searching for a way into Europe's diplomatic and commercial heart. The Great Northern War, fought from 1700 to 1721, was the crucible in which Russia learned to wage modern war, built a navy, and carved a permanent window to the Baltic. The conflict was not a single moment of destiny, but a long sequence of gambles, disasters, reinventions, and political bargains. Yet, when the smoke cleared 2 decades later, the map and the instruments of power in Northern and Eastern Europe had changed in ways that made Russia an unmistakable European great power. This is the story of how that transformation began. At the turn of the 18th century, Sweden's position was the legacy of the long 17th century. Victories under Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War, diplomatic gains at Westphalia in 1648, and subsequent conquests across the eastern Baltic had created a realm that controlled the sea approaches to Livonia, Estonia, and Ingria. Swedish rule in the Baltics rested on a tight military system. Highly trained infantry, the Karelians, rigorous discipline, rapid maneuver, and a leadership culture that prized initiative. For much of Northern Europe, the image of Sweden was of a compact, mobile army that seemed to make distance and size irrelevant. Russia, by contrast, had spent the previous century and a half under a much different set of pressures. The time of troubles in the early 600s, the dynastic upheavals, and repeated incursions had left its institutions weaker and its borders insufficient for the ambitions of a centralized state that wanted both security and trade. Crucially, Russia lacked reliable access to the Baltic. The Treaty of Stolbovo, 1617, had closed off direct Russian access to the sea. And for generations, the state's western horizons were framed more by landward steppe and Muscovite consolidation than by seaports and fleets. That lack of maritime outlets translated into diplomatic isolation and constrained commerce with Western Europe. The personalities who would shape the opening moves of war were as consequential as the armies. On the Swedish side stood Charles XII, the young warrior king whose decision-making and luck would initially propel Sweden to remarkable successes. Opposing him in the first years were an array of actors who coalesced into an anti-Swedish coalition. Augustus II, Elector of Saxony and King of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway, and Peter Alexeyevich, Tsar of Russia. A lesser-known but pivotal figure was Johann Reinhold Patkul, a Livonian nobleman whose personal grievances against Swedish rule helped knit together the diplomatic underpinnings of the coalition. Patkul's career, his defection from Swedish authority, his lobbying in Dresden and Moscow, and his eventual execution illustrates how diplomatic networks and elite grievances could catalyze a continental confrontation. The war opened in 1700 with an audacious diplomatic and military stroke, a near-simultaneous pressure on Sweden from Denmark, Saxony-Poland, and Russia. Denmark was the first to act, seeking to exploit the prospect of a youthful Swedish king and the wider coalition to recover territories. But Charles XII reacted with speed that surprised contemporaries. In August 1700, under pressure from an Anglo-Dutch convoy and the threat of being fought on multiple fronts, Denmark accepted a separate settlement at Travendal and withdrew from the war, an early example of how external sea powers and diplomacy could constrain continental coalitions. This left Charles to turn east. Imagine a Baltic morning in late November 1700. Mist over the quay at Narva, the air piercing and cold. Charles XII, barely in his 20s, faced a vastly larger Russian army. At the Battle of Narva, November 30, 1700, Old Style, often recorded in modern accounts as early December, a shock went through contemporaries and through later historians. A dramatic Swedish victory achieved not by overwhelming numbers, but by audacity, discipline, and effective use of weather and terrain. Snow and wind masked Swedish assault, and the Swedish troops, trained to rapid, close combat and coordinated volleys, smashed into the Russian positions. Contemporary observers called it a rout, Modern scholarship warns against exaggerated claims about numbers and losses, but there is no question that Sweden's tactical mastery at Narva was spectacular, and that the defeat humiliated Peter's forces. The immediate strategic effect of Narva was both dramatic and paradoxical. For Sweden, it was a morale-boosting confirmation that the Carolean system could still dominate. Charles could now project military power across Poland and the Baltic littoral, seeking to secure Sweden's eastern possessions and to impose a compliant Polish king. For Russia, the shock was existential. The rout exposed critical weaknesses in training, command, artillery, and logistics. Yet it did not end Russian ambitions. If anything, Narva created the condition that made Peter the rest of his reign, learning by crisis. Peter's reaction after Narva is central to understanding the causal link between the war and Russia's later imperial form. He did not accept the defeat as a mere setback. He set about systematic institutional change. The reforms that grew out of the humiliation of 1700 were not instantaneous miracles. They were lengthy, uneven, and painfully costly. They included efforts to build a navy from scratch, to professionalize and expand artillery, to reform recruitment and training, and to modernize administrative systems that could extract the resources necessary for sustained warfare. These changes were not merely military tweaks. They reconfigured the state's interactions with society, introducing conscription practices, mobilizing skilled labor for shipyards and cannon foundries, and developing administrative bodies to manage supply, transport, and finance. To see how learning translated into capability, consider the Navy. Before the war, Russian seafaring capability on the Baltic was marginal. Peter had already shown an interest in shipbuilding in the 1690s. He famously traveled in disguise to study shipyards in Western Europe. But the energetic expansion that followed Narva was a direct strategic response. Shipyards were established along the Baltic coast, including the first significant works that would later anchor Russia's naval presence. The creation of a navy was not only about winning sea battles. It was about securing the logistics, supply lines, and coastal bases that made territorial control in the Baltic sustainable. A crown that could not put men and guns on the sea could not hope to sustain occupation or defend its ports. Simultaneous with naval projects were artillery and training reforms. Peter invested in foundries, in artillery officers, and in drilling practices that over time reduced the qualitative gap with Swedish musketeers and artillery crews. Training camps, modeled in part on Western practices, began to professionalize units that had once been irregular or militia in character. Modern estimates emphasize that these reforms were cumulative. The army that faced Charles in 1709 was not a direct copy of Western models, but a new Russian tool, larger, more administratively supported, and increasingly capable of combined operations with field artillery and coordinated logistics. The capture of Baltic fortresses and the foundation of a new port city crystallized the strategic logic that animated these reforms. In 1702 and 1703, Russian forces made gains that would have seemed unlikely before Narva. The seizure of Nyenskans in 1703 and the decision to construct a new city on territory newly wrested from Sweden marked a decisive strategic turn. Peter founded St. Petersburg in 1703 not as a cultural whim, but as a calculated act of statecraft, to create a Western, sea-facing capital that would anchor Russian access to the Baltic, provide a naval base, and signal Russia's emergence into European maritime and diplomatic networks. The city's location, on low, marshy ground at the mouth of the Neva, was inhospitable, expensive, and strategically awkward in the short term. But precisely for those reasons, it reflected a long-term strategic reorientation, a willingness to pay the cost of building new institutions and infrastructure to secure a permanent foothold on the Baltic littoral. This period also showed how state capacity mattered as much as battlefield skill. Sweden's early campaigns, Glissö 1702, Fraustadt 1706, and other victories, demonstrated tactical excellence and political leverage across Poland and northern Germany. Sweden's ability to move rapidly, use decisive tactical formations, and exploit divided enemies made it a fearsome opponent. But over long distances, where supply lines were stretched and the weather and seasons brutal, the durability of an opponent's logistical system and administrative reach became decisive. Russia's advantage was not immediate. It emerged gradually as Peter's reforms expanded the state's capacity to raise, feed, and equip armies and to replace losses over time. Where Swedish armies often relied on short, intense campaigns supported by local requisitions or rapid movement, Russia increasingly developed a hinterland advantage: depth of manpower, the ability to draw on domestic supplies, and the capacity to sustain long campaigns even at high social and economic cost. The diplomatic context amplified these material shifts. Pat Kuhl's early role in seeking allies shaped the coalition politics that brought Sweden multiple adversaries, but also created centrifugal pressures. Sovereigns had different aims. Augustus II sought to control the Polish throne and was willing to trade political influence in exchange for military engagement. Denmark had its own territorial aims. For Russia, the diplomatic alliances were less about immediate territorial gain and more about creating an opportunity to pry open access to the Baltic while its institutions caught up with the demands of modern war. Yet alliances were fragile. They shifted with battlefield fortunes, personal politics, and pressure from other European courts. For instance, the quick diplomatic settlement with Denmark in 1700, brought about by pressure from Britain and the Netherlands, proved how external powers could constrain or redirect Northern European conflicts. The interplay between battlefield outcomes and diplomatic bargaining repeatedly shaped the possibilities available to each side. If Narva was a shock that exposed Russian weakness, the years that followed were a test of whether Peter's reforms could convert humiliation into sustainable advantage. The answer was not self-evident. Between 1701 and 1706, Swedish arms continued to score victories in Poland and on the Baltic littoral. At Klissow, 1702, Charles pushed into Polish territory, and at Fraustadt, 1706, Swedish forces inflicted another heavy defeat on Saxon-Polish armies. The young king's aggression in Central Europe seemed to vindicate Sweden's military model. Yet these successes also buried costs. The occupation, extended lines, and the need to maintain garrisons across a wide theater strained Sweden's resources and political cohesion. Militarily brilliant armies can, in time, be worn down if the opponent is prepared to accept attrition and to mobilize the administrative machinery of state to sustain long campaigns. Several episodes in these early years revealed the growing divergence between Swedish operational brilliance and Russian institutional resilience. Russian sieges of key fortresses, Notborg, Noteborg, Nienskans, and later Vyborg, took time, but each capture enlarged Russian control of the Baltic littoral and provided bases for naval construction and coastal defense. The insistence upon fortresses and ports rather than only decisive pitched battles reflected Peter's strategic calculus. Control of coastal nodes and harbors was the precondition for durable influence in the Baltic region. Each fortified port that Russia added to its portfolio multiplied its options, commercial, naval, and diplomatic, and tied the war's military dynamics to the state's longer-term capacity to govern and extract resources. This was not merely a story of iron and timber. The war's human and social costs should be measured alongside the institutional gains. Swedish occupation and counter-occupations produced severe suffering in Finland and elsewhere. Looting, forced conscription, deportations, and civilian casualties were part of the brutal arithmetic of early modern war. Contemporary accounts and later studies reconstruct episodes of what Finns later called the Great Hatred, a period of widespread devastation and reprisals. While the full demographic consequences are debated, scholars generally agree that these campaigns devastated local economies and populations in affected regions. For Russia, mobilizing the manpower and labor needed for shipyards and construction, sometimes through forced labor or oppressive requisition, created social strains and resentment at home. The state's capacity to carry such burdens without collapsing was a test of its emerging imperial character, a willingness to deploy coercive instruments of rule in service of strategic ends. By the mid-1700s, Russia's military reforms were becoming visible on the battlefield in more than rhetorical ways. Training systems produced officers and NCOs with greater technical competence. Artillery park expansions allowed for more sustained bombardments during sieges, and the nascent fleet began to project presence in coastal waters. Importantly, these changes did not simply mimic Western models. They created a hybrid Russian military system that mixed native practices with selectively adopted Western techniques. That hybrid nature had consequences for how the state organized itself. Supply depots, riverine transport, and local administrative networks became as important as drill manuals. In short, Russia's evolving instruments of power were material, administrative, and institutional at once. Yet the trajectory remained fragile. Early reformers faced internal resistance from traditional elites, logistical bottlenecks, and the sheer inertia of a vast empire. Peter's modernization project required not only new institutions, but also personnel who could operate them. Where Sweden's military culture produced cadres with decades of combat experience and institutional memory, Russia had to create comparable human capital in a compressed time frame. This gap helps explain why the war's middle years would hinge on whether the Russians could sustain reforms and whether Swedish operational advantages could be blunted by depth and attrition. The strategic geography of the Baltic intensified these dynamics. Control of ports such as Reval, Tallinn, Riga, and the approaches to the Gulf of Finland mattered not only for military action, but for commerce. Whoever controlled the coasts could influence trade, raise tariffs, and draw merchant networks toward their ports, an economic payoff that underpinned political leverage. For Peter, the calculus was clear. Without reliable ports and a fleet to protect them, Russia would forever be at a disadvantage in Northern European politics. The intentionality behind St. Petersburg, expensive, exposed, and politically controversial, was an investment in that long-term transformation. So the first decade of the war, roughly 1700 to 1709, must be read as a duel between immediate Swedish maneuver and Russian institutional accumulation. Swedish victories showcased tactical superiority, Russian responses built capacity. The crucial question of the war's middle years was whether that capacity could be converted into strategic outcomes: territory, naval control, and diplomatic recognition. The stakes mattered for more than the immediate belligerents. A successful Russian turn toward the Baltic would reconfigure European diplomacy by adding a new great power with naval ambitions and a willingness to project influence beyond its rear borders. It would also change the logic of warfare in Northern Europe, making long wars of attrition and logistics, rather than single-pitched triumphs, central to strategic calculation. At the heart of this transformation were people who bridged the gap between royal will and administrative reality. Commanders such as Boris Sheremetev and Alexander Menshikov emerged as executors of Peter's reforms. Sheremetev's roles in field command and Menshikov's in organizing supplies and coastal operations were examples of how a new cadre, some promoted from humble origins, others reinvented nobles, implemented a policy of sustained pressure. On the Swedish side, generals including Carl Gustav Renskold and Magnus Stenbock demonstrated the operational quality that made Swedish arms formidable. Their actions forced the Russians to innovate rather than merely capitulate. A second structural constraint that shaped campaign plans was logistics. Early modern warfare depended on the movement of food, fodder, ammunition, and siege material. Sweden's early operational model emphasized speed and improvisation. Russia's developing model emphasized deliberate investment in supply chains, depots, and transport infrastructure. In campaigns that stretched into the harsh northern winters, these logistic systems were often decisive. Where Sweden could achieve surprise and rapid gains, Russia's deeper storage and transport capacity often allowed it to outlast campaigns and rebuild after reverses. This was not merely an abstract lesson, it was the material mechanism by which Peter hoped to translate reform into empire. The interplay between tactical brilliance and strategic depth produced a particular kind of historical suspense as the war moved into its middle phase. Would the Swedish army's panache and Charles's bold leadership continue to peak at the decisive moments? Or would the accumulation of Russian administrative capacity and coastal control eventually break Sweden's ability to sustain its maritime empire? The answer required time, and it required the painful trial of more battles, sieges, supply runs, and diplomatic wheeling, events that would produce both setbacks and opportunities for both sides. It is here, after the humiliation at Narva, but before the decisive confrontations that would come later, that one can most clearly see the causal threads leading to Russia's imperial future. The humiliation forced a rethink. The reforms converted that rethink into new material capabilities. The capture of ports and construction of St. Petersburg anchored those capabilities in geography. And the gradual professionalization of officers and administrators began converting temporary gains into enduring institutions. None of this guaranteed success. It merely created the conditions in which success became possible. Importantly, the transformation was costly, financially, politically, and in human lives, and it required a ruler willing to accept those costs. By the mid-1700s, already years into the war, this reorientation had begun to reshape the diplomatic landscape. Sweden's aura of invincibility had been dented, even if its armies remained dangerous. Russia's presence on the Baltic, embodied in a new city rising out of marshes and in shipyards clattering with hammers, meant that European states could no longer treat Muscovy as a peripheral inland power. The war's early decades turned the argument from "Can Russia reach the Baltic?" to "If Russia stays, how will other powers respond?" And that is where the narrative tension tightens. Peter's reforms had created new instruments of power. They had not yet converted every defeat into victory. New campaigns would test whether Lesnaya and Poltava, battles later to become shorthand for Russian resurgence, were the inevitable results of reform or contingent outcomes of particular operational mistakes by Sweden. The next phase of the war would turn on supply convoys, the timing of marches across frozen plains, weather and leadership wounds, and the fragile coherence of alliances. The question that reshaped Northern Europe remained the same. Could a state that had been excluded from the Baltic for generations, through deliberate investment and the willingness to accept enormous social costs, transform that exclusion into a permanent strategic advantage? Sources and scholarship vary on the details. Estimates of troop numbers, casualty ranges, and the precise sequence of movements often differ in the primary chronicles and later histories. Where figures are uncertain, this account favors ranges and highlights scholarly consensus over single-source claims. For the reader's orientation, recommended works that informed this narrative include contemporary chronicles and modern syntheses that balance military detail with institutional analysis. Robert Massey's narrative works illuminate personalities. Scholars such as Isabel de Madariaga and Michael C. Paul offer detailed studies of Peter's reforms and Russia's military institutions. And the edited collections on the Great Northern War provide a robust bibliography of primary documents and campaign studies. If the first decade of fighting can be summarized in a single idea, it is that the war forced a question of statecraft, whether a ruler could convert humiliation into capacity by remaking institutions, paying brutal social costs, and committing to a maritime turn. The coming sequence of campaigns, Lesnaya, the march into Ukraine, and the fateful summer that included Poltava, would put that answer to the test. Only by tracing those operations in detail can one see the precise mechanisms by which battlefield learning, logistical depth, and diplomatic bargaining combined to make possible the emergence of Russia as an imperial player on the Baltic stage. If this kind of long-form historical deep dive interests you, consider subscribing. There are more episodes planned that will map the later campaigns, the decisive battles, and the treaties that finally reshaped the map of Northern Europe. As the war moved deeper into the 1700s, the operational tempo shifted. Swedish victories had begun to thin into costly occupations and protracted sieges. Russian reforms accumulated into tangible increases in manpower and supply. The winter campaigns and spring maneuvers of 1707 to 1708 would crystallize these tensions. A Swedish decision to march far to the southeast, seeking supplies and a decisive engagement on the Ukrainian steppe, set the stage for confrontations where logistics, geography, and timing, not only tactical audacity, would decide the result. Russia's growing administrative reach allowed it to contest those deep marches, but only if its logistics and field leadership could keep pace with the demands of extended operations. At the operational level, the campaign choices made by Swedish commanders, especially the decision to carry forward into Ruthenia, exposed the fragility of a strategy based on rapid movement when supply lines ran thin. Conversely, Russian commanders learned to use interior lines and scorched earth techniques not merely as a measure of cruelty, but as deliberate methods to constrain a foe who relied on living off the land. These methods exacerbated the suffering of civilian populations, Finns, Poles, Ruthenians, whose lives and economies were devastated by the passage of armies. The moral cost of empire building in this theater was explicit and profound. Yet, tactical and moral judgments aside, the broader strategic pattern was becoming clear. Sweden could still win battles, but Russia was steadily moving from a position of reactive reform to active contestation. The seas, the ports, and the institutions that sustained long wars were now the weapons with which Peter intended to shape his country's future. How that intention would fare against the blunt realities of war, weather, disease, the luck of wounds, and the alignment of allies was the question that would determine whether Russia's window to Europe became a permanent doorway or a temporary aperture. The next campaigns would answer that question with decisive, bloody clarity. The turning point that Peter's long reforms needed came not in a single flash, but in a sequence of grim, closely linked episodes. The interception of Swedish supply, the attrition of an army far from its bases, and a summer battle on the Ukrainian plains that would unmake an invasion. In the autumn of 1708, a Swedish relief column under General Adam Ludwig Lewenhaupt set out from the Baltic provinces with wagons, artillery, and provisions intended to link up with Charles XII, who was then pushing deep into Ruthenia. That convoy was the logistical lifeline for a campaign that had already stretched Swedish endurance to its limits. At Lesnaya, the opportunity to sever that lifeline presented itself. Lesnaya, fought in late September 1708, Old Style, modern scholars often translate as 1708/1709 depending on calendar conversion, has long been called with justified bluntness the mother of Poltava. While the numbers remain debated, contemporary claims and later tallies diverge, most modern estimates place Lewenhaupt's force and train at several thousand men and hundreds of wagons, while Russian field elements under Peter's direction and local commanders such as Alexander Menshikov and Boris Sheremetev fielded comparable numbers but possessed the strategic advantage of interior lines and local intelligence. The engagement itself unfolded as a running series of clashes along forested roads and ridgelines. Russian detachments harried the convoy, skirmishing, passing volleys of cavalry, and seizing bridges. When formal battle coagulated near Lesnaya village, the Russians pushed aggressively, using massed infantry and artillery to batter formations and to cut off retreat routes. What mattered at Lesnaya was less the neat arithmetic of killed and captured and more the material effect. Lewenhaupt arrived with far less than he had hoped, and much of his provision and heavy equipment was lost or stranded. Estimates vary. Some contemporary accounts claimed huge captures, while later scholarly reconstructions moderate those numbers. But the qualitative result is clear. The Swedish invasion force that Charles depended upon now faced a severe supply deficit. The convoy's diminution reduced Swedish strategic flexibility. It made Charles's plans dependent on local requisition and on what remained of his own baggage. In short, Lesnaya transformed a campaign of maneuver into one constrained by scarcity. That scarcity would be decisive. The winter of 1708-1709 deepened the crisis. The Russian scorched earth measures, combined with an infamous northern winter, produced famine, sickness, and desertion within the Swedish ranks. The campaign into the Ukrainian hinterland, originally conceived as a bold stroke to secure winter quarters and perhaps a decisive engagement, became a march of attrition. Charles's army, once the model of aggressive mobility, was reduced in effective numbers and scope. Add to this the political gamble with local actors. The hetman Ivan Mazepa's defection to the Swedish cause in 1708 promised recruitment and local support, but failed to produce the mass Cossack backing Charles had hoped for. Many Cossack regiments remained wary or hostile, and the promised mobilization of local resources proved limited. The result was that Charles stood before a Russian army that had recovered its composure, improved its artillery, and prepared effectively for a fight on terrain of its choosing. The Battle of Poltava, fought in June-July 1709, commonly given as July 8, 1709 in the Gregorian calendar and June 27 Old Style, is the most analyzed turning point of the war, and for good reason. Here tactical detail matters, and the causal mechanisms that link battlefield outcome to state capacity become visible. Sweden's operational posture at Poltava has been described by contemporaries and later analysts as courageous but worn. Charles XII, a leader of undoubted tactical daring, arrived at Poltava with an army deprived of its expected supplies, diminished by winter attrition, and attempting an offensive against a prepared position. Reports differ about Charles's health. Some contemporaries claimed he was suffering from fever or the effects of earlier wounds. Modern historians caution that illness and exhaustion likely affected both his judgment and the army's coherence. Whatever the precise medical facts, the command on the Swedish side was fractured by fatigue and by an absence of reserves that earlier tactical triumphs had allowed. On the Russian side, the battlefield had been prepared with deliberation. Peter and his subordinates turned lessons from earlier defeats into defensive practice. They deployed entrenchments, redoubts, and a more developed artillery park, products of the logistic and technical reforms undertaken after Narva. Early modern artillery was not yet the precisely calculated science it would later become, but the increase in Russian artillery, both in number and in the skill of crews, gave the defenders a qualitative edge at Poltava. Russian infantry, drilled more consistently, and a more capable cavalry contingent could hold and counterattack where previously they might have faltered. The clash itself unfolded with classic agony. Swedish attempts to storm Russian redoubts and break the defensive line were met by concentrated fire. Where Swedish cavalry had previously swept open fields with devastating effect, at Poltava the terrain and the Russian dispositions blunted their impact. Contemporary survivors described scenes of close fighting, of charges repulsed against prepared positions, and of the accumulating effect of artillery and musketry upon formations already weakened by the campaign. When the Swedish center finally gave way, the strategic consequences were immediate. The invasion collapsed into rout and surrender. In the immediate aftermath, Charles escaped with a small retinue, ultimately finding refuge in Ottoman territory, first in Bender, present-day Tehina, in Moldavia, where he would remain for several years. A much larger Swedish force, however, did not escape. At the crossing near Petrovolocna, many thousands, estimates vary, but modern scholarship generally suggests figures in the low tens of thousands overall for the Swedish contingents involved in the retreat, laid down arms to Alexander Menshikov and his detachments. Those prisoners were transported into Russian custody. Their fate was grim for many. Large numbers were detained in camps, moved across vast distances, and subjected to hard conditions. A significant proportion never returned. The capture and internment of so many trained Swedish soldiers had two interrelated effects. It removed a military cadre from the Swedish order of battle for years to come, and it supplied Russia with bargaining chips and manpower. Prisoners were sometimes pressed into service or used for labor in remote regions, evidencing how war fed into state capacity even as it inflicted human costs.
Poltava's immediate strategic consequence was unambiguous. Sweden's projection into Eastern Europe disintegrated. Charles's aura of invincibility was shattered, and Russia's path to the Baltic and to diplomatic recognition of its new status became significantly clearer. Yet crucially, Poltava did not create Russian capacity out of nothing. It was the visible culmination of sustained institutional effort. Improved artillery, a nascent navy securing supply lines, reorganized logistics that permitted sustained operations, and an administrative apparatus that marshaled resources across a vast empire. In that sense, Poltava can be read as the operational validation of Peter's reforms.
Once the Swedes were driven from the Ukrainian theater, the focus of conflict shifted back to the Baltic littoral and the naval war, spaces where Russia's recent investments began to pay continuous dividends. The capture of key fortresses and port towns in the years after Poltava demonstrates how military victory on land translated into geopolitical leverage at sea. In 1710, several Baltic cities, most notably Vyborg, Revel, Tallinn, and Riga, fell or capitulated to Russian sieges. These were not always swift affairs. Sieges combined bombardment, blockade, and the grim arithmetic of disease. Riga, a major Hanseatic and Baltic hub, surrendered after negotiations that also wrested concessions from its elite, while Revel and Vyborg added strategic depth to Russia's littoral control. Each port that changed hands became not just a symbol but a node, a place to build ships, shelter squadrons, base convoys, and levy customs duties. The capture of ports turned the coastline into a string of graspable assets rather than merely contested sea lanes. On the sea itself, Russia's growing competence was manifest in operations that challenged Swedish maritime dominance. The Battle of Gangut in July 1714, sometimes given as July 27 Old Style, July 8 Gregorian in some accounts, stands out as the first major Russian naval victory in the Baltic. It was not a grand line of battle engagement in the Western sense, but a galley action in shallow coastal waters, an arena in which the newly expanded Russian galley flotilla could outmaneuver larger but less agile Swedish ships. Gangut signaled that Russia could contest coastal approaches, interdict supply routes, and use a maritime force to complement land operations. Later Russian raids along Sweden's eastern seaboard, particularly in 1719 to 1721, left lasting damage. Towns were burned, merchant shipping assaulted, and the very idea of Swedish security in the eastern Baltic was undermined. These raids were not merely tactical reprisals, they were a deliberate instrument to pressure Stockholm politically and economically towards peace. At the same time, Sweden's capacity to respond was eroding. Far from home, drained of manpower, and politically strained by prolonged warfare, the Swedish realm found itself fighting on multiple fronts, in Finland, in Pomerania, and against increasingly efficient Russian coastal operations. There were still pockets of Swedish success. The victory at Gottebusch in December 1712 under Magnus Stenbock remains a striking example of Swedish operational quality in northern Germany. But such triumphs proved insufficient to reverse strategic decay. Stenbock himself would later be trapped and captured at Turning in 1713, and Sweden's ability to translate local victories into durable advantage was by then severely constrained. The human toll during these later campaigns was severe and in many places brutal. In Finland, the occupation and counter-occupation produced what contemporaries and later Finns called the Great Hatred: widespread pillage, forced migration, and atrocities that devastated villages and towns. Coastal populations in Sweden proper suffered from raids and requisitions. In Poland, Ruthenia, and the Baltic provinces, forced conscriptions and deportations disrupted economies and demographic patterns. Russian use of deportation and forced labor to supply shipyards, munition works, and fortification projects helped make St. Petersburg and other infrastructural projects possible, but those projects were built at the expense of communities and individuals who endured conscription, heavy taxes, and often brutal treatment.
While the war's long-run institutional gains for states are analytically meaningful, they came mingled with human misery that contemporary observers recorded and that later historians treat with solemn attention. Diplomacy after Poltava gradually reflected the new balance of power that had emerged. Augustus II regained confidence and influence once allied to the ascendant Russian court. His earlier humiliation at Altenstadt, 1706, where he had been forced to renounce claims in favor of a Swedish puppet, was reversed in the wake of Poland's reconfiguration after 1709. Sweden, isolated and exhausted, sought peace on terms that reflected its diminished leverage. The process of peace was incremental. Bilateral agreements and multi-party settlements disentangled the complex web of wartime claims. Treaties such as Altenstadt, 1706, mark early diplomatic disruptions. Later agreements, most notably the Treaty of Fredericksborg between Sweden and Denmark in 1720, the separate arrangements Sweden made with Prussia and Hanover in 1719–1720, and the concluding Treaty of Nystad in 1721, formalized the transfer of territory and the diplomatic recognition of Russia's new position. Nystad, signed in 1721, is the capstone. It ceded to Russia Ingria, Estonia, Livonia, and parts of Karelia, territories that gave Peter's realm the durable Baltic frontage he had sought. These treaties were not merely territorial bookkeeping. They rewrote the rules of commerce, naval access, and diplomatic alignments in Northern Europe. The immediate post-war settlement made Russia a Baltic power in the most literal sense. With ports and naval bases under imperial control, Russia could sustain a fleet, protect trade, and exert influence over Baltic commerce. But the war's real legacy was institutional rather than simply geographical. The Russian state left the conflict with a larger and more permanent standing army, a fledgling but operational navy, and administrative mechanisms capable of maintaining those instruments.
Peter's domestic reforms, reorganized fiscal systems, new bureaucratic collegia, and an expanded administrative reach into provincial governance did not result only from military need, but the demands of 2 decades of continuous warfare concentrated the political will to create them. The state's capacity to levy taxes, to conscript labor and soldiers, and to direct industrial resources, ironworks, foundries, shipyards, was now more developed and routinized than it had been in the 17th century. If one asks how these changes shaped Russia's imperial future, the answer rests on several interlocking mechanisms. First, territorial access to the Baltic removed a long-standing strategic constraint. Access to Western maritime markets, navies, and diplomatic theaters was no longer mediated exclusively by hostile or neutral powers. Second, the institutional reforms, the nascent professional officer corps, improved artillery and logistics, and bureaucratic innovations created the tools a state needs to operate beyond its hinterland. Third, the symbolic and diplomatic cachet of victory mattered. Once accepted as a power that could influence the northern balance, Russia could enter European coalitions and negotiations from a position of parity rather than supplication. All three combined to convert the short-run military victories of the 1710s into a durable change in Russia's international trajectory. Yet important caveats remain. It would be a mistake to read the Great Northern War as a teleological march toward imperial destiny. The results depended on contingent episodes, the timing of weather, the misfortune or miscalculation of opponents, the bravery or folly of commanders, and the shifting politics of alliances. Had Leeuwenhoek's convoy reached Charles intact, or had winter conditions been less catastrophic, or had the Ottoman Empire detained Charles in ways that provoked a different diplomatic sequence, outcomes might have differed. The war's end created new capacities and altered possibilities, but it did not make empire automatic or inevitable. Moreover, the social and economic costs that underwrote Peter's ability to build St. Petersburg and a navy, forced labor, heavy taxation, and prolonged conscription, left legacies of resentment and hardship whose effects shaped internal Russian politics for decades. After the formal peace accords, the geopolitical map of Northern Europe looked markedly different. Sweden's centuries of power projection were broken, its realm contracted to a more narrowly defined Scandinavian and Baltic heartland. Russia's boundaries and naval basing rights now put it squarely within the circuits of European power politics. Other states, Prussia, Hanover, Denmark, adjusted their calculations, and diplomacy in the first half of the 18th century would henceforth include an assertive Russia as an essential partner or antagonist. The cultural and institutional imprint of the war also demands attention. St.
Petersburg, the most tangible monument to Peter's strategic turn, served as both an administrative hub and a symbol. Built at enormous human and material cost, the city became Russia's architectural statement of Western aspiration and strategic intent. Peter moved much of the court there, orienting his capital toward waterways and contacts with Western Europe. That geographic reorientation mattered not merely for trade, but for identity and for the recruitment of foreign expertise that fed ongoing military and industrial modernization. The city's shipyards, academies, and mercantile institutions became conduits through which expertise flowed, further entrenching the transformation initiated under wartime urgency. At an institutional level, the war hastened the professionalization of the Russian officer corps and promoted a meritocratic impulse, occasionally and unevenly, by which competent commanders, technicians, and administrators could rise. Menshikov, Sheremetev, and others whose backgrounds were not those of the ancient boyar elite found in wartime opportunity a path to prominence. The creation and expansion of state structures to collect revenue, house logistics, and manage prisoner populations demonstrated a bureaucratic elasticity that future Russian rulers would exploit in projects of imperial governance. Finally, consider the change in the nature of warfare itself. The Great Northern War highlighted that in the early 18th century, the decisive variables were as often logistical and administrative as they were tactical heroics. Sweden's model, fast, aggressive campaigns that relied on initiative and short-term logistics, could win battles but struggled to convert those victories into durable control when faced with an adversary that built capacity for protracted warfare. Russia's triumphs thus prefigured a wider European shift. The centrality of permanent armies, navies, and state bureaucracies in sustaining power over territories and seas. If one were to sum up the causal chain in clinical terms, a tactical humiliation, Narva, induced an elite-driven reform program. That program produced new military and naval capabilities and administrative means to sustain them. Those capabilities were tested and validated in a string of operational episodes: Lesnaya, the march into Ukraine, and Poltava. And once validated, they enabled territorial acquisitions and diplomatic recognition that reoriented Northern Europe. Each step contained contingency, expense, and violence. None guaranteed the next. But the chain is historically plausible and well attested. The war provided both the practical lessons and the political impetus Russia needed to leave the confines of an inland, agrarian polity and to join the concert of European great powers as a maritime, administrative, and territorial actor. The human ledger of that transformation is ambivalent.
The state that could now enforce conscription and extract timber for shipyards could also move populations, impose heavy fiscal burdens, and preside over scenes of wartime brutality. Civilians in Finland, the Baltic provinces, and across the Polish and Ruthenian theater suffered displacement and ruin. Prisoners, both Swedish and local levies, were subjects in a regime of captivity that reshaped entire communities. The archival traces of these sufferings appear in petitions, memoirs, and parish registers. Historians must balance admiration for institutional achievement with a sober accounting of the war's human costs. Looking beyond the immediate decades, the Great Northern War's structural effects endured. Russia's expanded access to trade, its more professional military, and the presence of a Western-facing capital created durable points of leverage. That leverage allowed the Russian state to engage more decisively in subsequent European politics, wars, and alliances, not as an occasional overland power, but as a maritime and continental actor whose interests reached into the Baltic, the Black Sea, and beyond. It reshaped comparative state development in Northern and Eastern Europe. Sweden receded, Poland's internal fragmentation deepened as outside powers intervened, and smaller states adjusted to a new balance of great power politics. For students of early modern war, the Great Northern War offers a multifaceted case. It is a laboratory for understanding how military defeat can produce reform, how logistics and administration determine strategic outcomes, and how the capture of ports and the construction of navies alter the economic and diplomatic foundations of power. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the moral price of state building and the human suffering that often accompanies the creation of empires. Recommended starting points for further reading and for sources to illustrate these arguments include biographies and institutional studies that balance military narrative with administrative analysis. For a comprehensive narrative of Peter and the era, Robert K. Mossie's Peter the Great is accessible though interpretive. Isabel de Madaraga's scholarship offers rigorous analysis of Peter's reforms and Russia's institutional transformations. Michael C. Paul provides detailed studies of military logistics and the interplay between warfare and state capacity. And collections of essays and campaign studies, edited volumes on the Great Northern War, offer granular treatments of particular battles and theaters. Primary sources, including diplomatic correspondence, Swedish war diaries, and Russian administrative records, often in translated editions or scholarly extracts, are indispensable for reconstructing contested figures and for understanding how contemporaries perceived the war's stakes. Editors and producers might wish to consult a concise bibliography slide with these and other works to guide viewers toward deeper scholarship.
In closing, then, how should we measure the war's effect on Russia's imperial future? Not as a single act of destiny, but as a prolonged crucible. The Great Northern War forced Russia to confront its military and administrative deficiencies, and, under Peter's determined leadership, to resolve them through costly reforms and bold state projects. By the war's end, Russia possessed the territorial frontage, naval institutions, military corps, and bureaucratic apparatus that transformed it from a great inland power into a state capable of projecting influence across the Baltic and into European diplomacy. That combination of territory, technology, and institutional reach is what historians mean when they identify the war as shaping Russia's imperial future. It was the moment when the instruments of empire, naval bases, standing armies, administrative machinery, were not merely experimented with, but deployed and consolidated on the international stage. If you want a focused deep dive on St. Petersburg's founding and the shipyards that powered Russia's naval emergence, there's a follow-up episode that traces the city's construction, its human costs, and its strategic role in detail. For those who support deeper research and want access to the source notes and archival excerpts that informed this episode, there is a patrons-only dossier with primary source translations and a campaign timeline. Sources and further reading: Robert K. Massey, Peter the Great, His Life and World. Isabel de Madariaga, Russia in the Age of Peter the Great. Michael C. Paul, The Military Revolution and the Great Northern War, and selected articles on logistics and artillery reform. Collections and campaign studies on the Great Northern War, edited by leading military historians, and primary source compilations of diplomatic correspondence, Swedish campaign diaries, and Russian administrative records, selected translated editions. These works provide a balance between narrative, institutional analysis, and the primary evidence needed to evaluate contested figures and episodes. If this exploration of how warfare, reform, and geography combined to reshape an empire, consider watching the next episode where we map the construction of St. Petersburg, the labor and logistics that created its shipyards, and the naval operations that made the Baltic a Russian sea.